Awesome. Thank you so much, Ilse. Thank you guys for tuning in to our painting class tonight. I'm super excited to paint English tea and peonies with you all. Like always, we're going to be working with FolkArt matte acrylic paint. So I'll go over the supply list so that you can be prepared to have everything with you to paint along. So I have an 8x10 stretched canvas and a variety of FolkArt matte paint. So those colors are pink, wicker white, fire coral, true blue, clover, baby pink, wild wasabi, minted aqua, vintage tea rose, and light blue. I also have an assortment of flat brushes, a couple of round brushes. I think I listed a really great CraftsMart variety pack for you guys to pick up. I have a water basin, something for my palette, paper towels to dry off my brushes, and then a blow dryer and a pencil. Okay, so without further ado, I think we're ready to go ahead and get started. I do want to mention, if you have any questions about anything that we're doing in our painting tonight, Stephen is also here in this chat, so we can answer any questions about the project and relay some of those questions over to me. For these painting classes, we do have to go a little quickly just because we want to make sure that we're able to fit in all of the content within our hour so that you guys get everything that you need. So like Ilse said, a lot of times people like to watch the painting first and then go back and paint in real time so that they can kind of pause the video, rewind it to their needs. So let's get started. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to pick up my pencil. And the first thing that we're going to sketch out is a wide U. So starting from a little below that midpoint of our canvas, and about 2.5 inches from my left is where we're going to start. I'm making a big U like this. Okay, and then at the top of our U here, I'm going to round it out, kind of making a wider, less dramatic U. And then at the bottom here, I'm going to make 2 lines, 1 and 2. And then kind of like we did with the top, I'm going to curve that connecting line. So now we have our little teacup shape. Okay, so now that we have our teacup, we're not going to worry about the handle just yet. I'm going to set my pencil down, and next I'm going to add to our palette some light blue and some minted aqua. And some wicker white. So I know it seems kind of silly, but you never really want to have any blank space in your canvas, even if that means, you know, our canvas is white. We still want to paint a white layer where we see white because it's really great to prime that canvas, but also it just gives it a more finished look to it. So first things first, I'm going to take my about 1/2 inch flat brush, dip it into my wicker white. And before I get ahead of myself, I'm going to go ahead and erase this line right here because we don't really need it. And it's less that we'll have to paint over. And we're going to fill in our teacup with our wicker white. I promise this will definitely be the most boring step of the night, so it only gets more exciting from here.
White on white.
Yeah, right?
You don't need to be super accurate with painting in the lines.
Yeah, right? It's good practice. Okay, now I'm gonna rinse my brush. And then I'm gonna take my 3/4 inch flat brush and I'm gonna dip it into my Minted Aqua. And really carefully, what I like to do whenever I'm painting the background of a canvas like this, when I am getting close to an object or a shape that we just painted, I like to carefully paint around it. I don't want to mix this minted aqua in with the white that we just painted and diminish our color of our minted aqua. So I'm painting a section of our background with that minted aqua, carefully brushing around our white teacup. But I'm working in sections because once you have a big patch of minted aqua like this, I'm going to dip just the edge of my brush, barely much at all, into my light blue and in a slip slapping motion. And what that means is I'm just kind of making X's with my brush. I'm going to work that light blue into our minted aqua, creating some depth and interest into the background of our painting. So definitely more minted aqua than light blue. And we're not rinsing our brush in between. These colors are going to blend a little bit, but it's going to create a really loose, choppy blend that's going to give us a beautiful, interesting background. So once you're done adding in your light blue to that first section, we're going to keep going with more of our minted aqua, and we're going to paint more sections of our canvas. And then again, slip slapping to introduce that light blue to our background. Going in all different directions, we get a really choppy feel. And then more minted aqua to finish up the background of our canvas. Okay, so now I'm going to go ahead and rinse my brush. And we're in a good stopping point right now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start to blow dry our canvas to get this first layer dry. Okay, so now I'm gonna pick back up my 1/2 inch flat brush and I'm not gonna dry my brush. I'm gonna introduce some of the water that's on my brush to some of my minted aqua here. So I'm mixing in the water from my brush into a little bit of our paint And really, essentially, we're just watering down this color quite a bit. And then taking our watered down minted aqua, you know what, I'm getting ahead of myself. Before we do that, I'm going to pick up my pencil and kind of like how we made this curved line connecting the top of our teacup, we're going to do an exact mirror of that. So we're going to create another line curving to mirror this top line here. Okay. And now picking back up our watered down minted aqua on the right side of our teacup, I'm starting at the right and I'm working my way over to the left, filling in sort of a shadow onto our teacup. In a sweeping motion. And you don't have to worry about staying within the lines really because our background is minted aqua too. I'm going to dip my brush into some of my water and continue dragging that shadow over like that. Okay, rinsing my brush. Now we're going to do a little bit more sketching. So right now we're going to focus on sketching the stems to our flowers. So we're kind of starting at the right side here. Our first stem is coming up here, and I'm going to draw one C and then mirror that, another C, creating a leaf. Another leaf here. Another stem kind of jutting out there. A leaf intersecting that. A leaf there. I'm going to draw a big circle here. It's going to be one of the bulbs of our flowers. Another circle here to hold the place of another flower. And then a third circle here, creating our third flower. And then coming from that third flower, some more stems and leaves. Okay. And while I have my pencil out, we're gonna draw in the handle of our teacup. So I'm starting with an arch, kind of a narrow arch like that. And then another arch. But before we connect it to the teacup, I'm gonna bring it down a little bit like that. Okay. So now I am going to add some true blue to our palette. And I'm going to take my #1 liner. So you can either work with a thin liner brush or a thin round brush, dipping it into my true blue. And I'm going to cover the bottom line of our teacup like that. Okay. If you find that maybe your brush is pulling a little bit and you can't create those long arcing lines like that, just add a little bit of water to your paint. That'll help the paint glide more smoothly across your canvas. Okay, and now with this line that we just painted in, we're going to create a scalloped pattern. So a bunch of little arches going all along the bottom of our teacup. Bunch of little arches. And then we're going to fill those in. Okay, next what we're going to do is we're going to make this little curly Q line going across our teacup. So if you want to, you can totally feel free to sketch that out before, but I am just going to wing it. So one thing that's good to do if you're going to wing it like me is I want to mark my starting point and my ending point, making sure that they're symmetrical at the same height. That's just going to help us stay in line with our design here. And we're just swirling, 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 doing loop-de-loops. So with this one, you don't want to hold a lot of pressure on your brush. Just let your brush kind of rest loosely in your hand. And we're letting our brush do most of the work, okay? And then connect it at the end there. And then under each little loop-de-loop, I'm going to place a dot. And then I'm going to outline the rim of our cup, not intersecting where we allotted space for our flowers and our leaves. I'm just going to let that be because we're going to fill that in with paint, so we don't have to worry about it. And then we're going to outline the handle of our cup. Like so. Okay. Gonna rinse our brush. And now to our palette, I'm going to add some Clover. And I'm going to pick up my liner brush again, rinse it off. Sure, it's nice and dry. And we are going to fill in our stems and our leaves with the Clover. So a stem there. And it's okay if this one intersects some of those circles where our flowers are going to be, because we're just going to cover those up later. So don't worry too much about that. I'm going to switch to use one of my tiny flat brushes and just fill in those leaf shapes with our clover. All right. Gonna rinse my brush. And then we're gonna go ahead and blow dry our canvas again. Okay, now to our palette, we're gonna add some wild wasabi. And I'm gonna pick up my small flat brush. And I'm gonna dip it into that wild wasabi. And what we're gonna do is we're gonna half all of our leaves. So let's focus on this leaf, the tallest leaf here. So I'm going to paint a line directly down the center of our leaf. And I'm gonna fill in 1/2 of the leaf. And it can be either side, it's up to you. The leaves in this painting are kind of whimsical and abstract. They're not really directed by any particular light source. You can just have fun with it. So it can be the top half, the bottom half, the left, the right, up to you. So we end up with something like that, okay? Gonna rinse my brush.
Sorry, what was the color? What other color can you use instead of wasabi?
You can really use any type of light green.
Yeah.
Any green that's lighter than your clover. Or you could, too, if you wanted, and you don't have a light green, you could use like a darker green. That would be pretty. Or like a teal would also work.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, so next to our palette, I'm gonna add some pink. All of our FolkArt paints have such fun names, like Vintage Tea Rose and Minted Aqua. This one's just called Pink. But it is a really, really pretty pink color. Sometimes it's best to keep things simple, right? If it's not broke, don't fix it. Okay, so adding some pink. See, isn't that a pretty color? I'm gonna take my 1/2-inch flat brush, dry it off, and I'm gonna fill in our circles. Okay, I'm gonna rinse my brush. Then we're gonna switch back to our greens for a second. So again, I'm gonna pick up my little flat brush, the tiny one, and I'm going to start doing some mixing. So I'm gonna add about 2 parts wild wasabi to 1 part clover. And then mix them until they're nice and well combined, so that we end up with a nice medium green color. And with this mixture, we're going to add a little bit of details to our leaves. So just a couple of brush strokes. They can be on 1/2 of your leaf. They can be in the middle of the dividing line. Be creative with it. Just little brush strokes on the sides. It could be in the middle. Some can be longer, some can be shorter. Like that. Okay. And again, I'm going to rinse my brush. And we're going to add some more colors to our palette. So I'm going to add our fire coral, our vintage tea rose, and our baby pink. Now I'm going to pick up my fire coral with our small flat brush. And we're going to do a bunch of comma strokes or C strokes around the centers of our circles. So starting in the center, comma, 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 bunch of C's jutting out to the very edge, and it can kind of take on a form of its own. So it doesn't have to stay perfectly within our circle. We can have a couple of rogue strokes to make it look more organic and less like a perfect circle. But they're layered and they're, kind of windowed, staggered almost. Some are longer, some are shorter. Whatever you think looks good. I'm sure it does. Okay. And now I'm not even going to rinse my brush. I'm just going to take a paper towel and offload as much of our fire coral as I can. It's okay if some of it's still on the brush, because it's okay if these pinks blend together. That will be pretty. Now I'm going to do the same thing, but now with our baby pink. So some of these strokes are going to overlap the fire coral. Some of the paints are going to blend together a little bit. That's totally, totally fine. And again, same deal. Some are shorter, some are longer. And because we're painting wet on wet, I am reloading my brush into my paint in between, most of the strokes, if not every. Because I want to have quite a bit of paint on my brush so that we're not just picking up the paint that's on the canvas, but we're picking up our paint from our palette. Okay, and it's all kind of circling into the center of our flower. Again, offload my brush with my paper towel. And we're gonna now dip into our vintage tea rose. So now is the point where if you think you're lacking one color, you can offload your brush. Just make sure that you know, it's best to offload your brush in between these colors, just so you can kind of maintain the integrity of the color. But if you think that you're missing one color or it needs more something, now's the time to just keep filling it in until you're happy with the way your flower looks. And I am pretty happy with the way that my flowers are looking. So now I'm going to rinse my brush again. And I'm going to take my blow dryer and focus on blow drying these flowers a bit. Okay, now that my flowers are pretty dry, I'm going to take that same small flat brush that we've been painting in our flowers with. Make sure it's nice and dry and rinsed off. And I'm going to dip it into my Clover again, that dark green color. And holding my brush perpendicular to my canvas, we're going to kind of create like a stippling effect. So we're just moving our brush up and down, kind of pouncing on the canvas in the centers, going in different directions. So I'm kind of moving my brush, turn, so that it's, you know, vertical, horizontal, kind of creating like a star burst pattern just in the center of my flowers, holding my brush again perpendicular. So once you do that with your Clover, I'm going to offload the Clover onto my paper towel. You don't need to rinse your brush. And then I'm going to dip into now my wild wasabi, this lighter green. We're going to do the same thing. If you think that you have too much of one color, go back and add the other. So I thought that I added a little too much wild wasabi. So now I'm going it back in with my Clover, kind of darkening that up again. You really can't mess up. And creating just the little centers of our flowers. Rinse your brush. I'm gonna take my liner brush, dip it into your favorite color that we used in our painting tonight. I think I'm gonna choose pink. And make sure the last thing that you do, sign your painting. And with that, we have English tea. Oh, the handle is still empty. Oops, you guys are totally right. I didn't even notice. Okay, it's okay. We'll fix it. I'm gonna grab my smallest flat brush. Make sure it's nice and dry. And we're gonna dip that into our Wicker white. And now it's like a coloring book. We're gonna use our white to fill in the handle of our teacup. And now we're finally done. Thank you guys for catching that.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so thank you guys so much for tuning in with us tonight to paint English tea and peonies. I hope you had as much fun as we did. Like we said in the beginning, this video will be posted to Michael's YouTube channel tomorrow, so you can go back and watch it at your own leisure. Thank you guys so much for tuning in, and we'll see you next time. Bye, guys.